Okay, I think we'll get started as we've got quite a lot to get through today. Welcome to today's workshop with Fisher ITS, where we are going to be discussing optimizing software license renewals for 2022. For those who have joined our workshops before, the format will be fairly familiar. We've taken a number of questions in advance from the audience today, which we'll be going through. Some of the questions have been around more general points on software renewal, so we're going to tackle those up front, and then we'll get into some of the more specific questions later on. Before we get into that, let's just have a quick refresher of who Fisher ITS are for those who haven't worked with us before. We are a UK-based software asset management and licensing consultancy firm. We primarily work with customers on software audit defense, license agreement optimizations, particularly around large renewals such as enterprise agreements or IBM agreements, and we deliver software asset management managed services. My name is Ben Eagling, and today I will be joined by my colleagues Hans Morkins, who is a senior manager at Fisher ITS, and Katerina Motlova, who is another senior manager here and specializes in IBM. If we just move on a slide, Hans, we'll talk through what we've got planned for today. So we find the most effective use of these sessions are really to answer your questions rather than going through endless slides of our own presentation. So what you'll see today is based on the questions that you have already asked. As mentioned, we are going to run through a typical renewals timeline that's going to be fairly vendor agnostic and look at the things that you need to consider in the run-up to most renewals. Now, we did receive a number of questions specifically focusing on Microsoft, which is no surprise, just due to how most organizations will be running Microsoft to some degree. So Hans is going to spend a little bit of time focusing on Microsoft in particular. We also did receive a number of questions on IBM in particular. Now, much of what we received so far will be answered in the initial run through of the software renewals timeline. But if you have any specific IBM questions, now is a really good time to ask them, with Katerina being on the call. It's a good opportunity to get some first-class advice on how to go about an IBM renewal. So questions can be answered through the Q&A pane at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We will be distributing slides and the recording of this session to those who registered tomorrow as well. So don't worry if you miss anything on one of the slides. We'll answer some of the live questions as we go through, or we'll perhaps save some up as well to answer in a session on this at the end, depending on the nature of the question. Okay, I think that covers everything. Hans, Kat, I'm going to hand over to you and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. So hello, everybody. As Ben said, we're going to first focus on some general things regarding software renewals. So first things first, let's have a look at a typical renewal timeline. So when you are nearing a time when there is a renewal coming up in your organization, we generally recommend to start the process of preparing for such renewal about 12 months before that specific date. That's the time where you want to select your project team to make sure that you have the right people who have the right information for your renewal. Whether you're renewing or whether you're planning to exit the contract, is always good to kind of build up to the whole process of going through the preparation for your renewal. About 9 months before the date, it's good to invest some time into seeing what is your license usage, what is your position when it comes to the products that you're using or the products that you might be using in the future, and also prepare effective license position if that's something that you want to do. Essentially, what you want to get in this step is you need to make sure that you know what your usage is at the moment. And also, ideally, you would like to see what your usage is going to be in the future, roughly. About 6 months before the renewal date, it's good to have a look on optimizing or potentially optimizing your license requirements and seeing what you want in the future. So you are using the information which you got from your effective license position or from your investigation of your usage at that point in time to see if there are any tasks that you can do to optimize your license spend, and also if there are any future requirements for projects that you should include in that specific renewal. About 3 months before the date, if required for the specific vendor and in your internal process, it is a good time to select the supplier for that renewal, and also start planning the negotiations. What is going to be your timeline for closing the renewal, and also what are the things that absolutely need to happen as part of this specific renewal. About a month before the date, you should be finalizing the negotiations with whoever supplier you choose, or with the vendor, if that's what you chose to do. And then that should lead you quite smoothly to contract execution at the date of the expiration of your renewal. So if you have a look at this timeline, it is quite long, but from our experience, it is worth to spend that time and invest that time into planning your renewal, because it gives you optimum time to go through the process with the right people, gather the right information, and make sure that the renewal is really what you need as a business.
Hey to add there, Katrina. Hi everyone, I'm Hans. So I think just to, obviously this is an ideal time, and Katrina's perfectly right there. Do keep in mind it's for large renewals. If you've got 5 licenses of Adobe expiring, probably you don't want to plan that a year in advance. But if you've got a large IBM, Microsoft, Oracle project thing coming up, renewal is definitely good, because you're going to want that time for the optimizations and such. At the very minimum for big renewals, we recommend 6 months. A smaller renewal, you could go with 3 months as well in your business, but 12 months is optimal. Right. Carry on, Katrina.
All right, thanks, Hans. All right, so we've already mentioned this as part of the process. For you to be prepared for the renewal, as the first things you need to understand your software usage. So this goes without saying, but we know it's harder to be said than done. So for the software usage, that really should be monitored regularly to make sure that you are aware of any peak usage or any potential non-compliance. You know when it happens and you know why it happens, but we know that this is quite hard to achieve in practice sometimes. So whether you have the opportunity to monitor your usage regularly, or you're going to be doing it as an ad hoc exercise, this should happen before your renewal to know what your position is at that moment. Do not blindly rely on your technical teams, because they are technical teams, they are not compliance experts. So very often we find our customers in a situation where the compliance team or the procurement team is expecting the technical teams to keep an eye not only on the functionality of the products, but also on the compliance. But that's generally not really what happens. So make sure that you involve the technical teams if you need to, but keep in mind that they usually don't understand the licensing rules, and compliance is not their first and foremost focus when it comes to running the applications in your estate. You should also make sure that you have a good visibility of your environment. So whether we're talking about relevant devices for that specific vendor, so if you have an Oracle DB renewal coming up, you should know where your databases are, or for vendors such as IBM, which can be spread out throughout your whole environment, you should make sure that you have a visibility of the whole environment. And don't forget about affiliates or other domains, which might not be something that you work with every day, but they still might carry products from that specific vendor. Just make sure that you're including everything, even the parts of your environment where there potentially could be deployment of that specific vendor. It's better to figure that out before the renewal to make sure that if there are any rogue installations or anything which is happening maybe under the radar, you can include it in the renewal if needed. As part of the process of learning about your usage and monitoring the peak usage on potential non-compliances is also a point of learning from the past issues. So if you know that there were any issues in the past with that specific vendor, try to remediate any triggers for that specific non-compliance, and try to get to a point where you feel like you have a good level of control over your estate, which will give you confidence going into the renewal with the specific vendor. If there is a genuine non-compliance, and it happens, it's life. So if you find that there is a genuine non-compliance in your estate, it cannot be remediated. It's just purely something that you need to keep. Make sure that you reflect this in your renewal planning to make sure that you make space for it in the budget or in the business justification for that specific vendor. And also, we've talked about the timeline before, but this goes specifically to discontinuing products. So if you know that your renewal is coming up, but you also plan to discontinue one or some of the products which normally would be part of that specific renewal, make sure that you create a realistic timeline for discontinuing these products to ensure that you really get to a point where you can comfortably say, yes, these are discontinued, they are gone, they are no longer a problem, and we can leave them out from the renewal. So we talked about what is happening at the moment. So what is your usage at the moment? But the renewal is not a point in time situation. You should be planning for what is coming next in the future as well. So as part of your renewal, you should be taking into consideration any potential future projects or realistic usage growth for that specific vendor. That is sometimes something that companies struggle with, to kind of tries to see in the future and try to include potential future projects. But especially if you're doing a bigger renewal, such as for IBM, if you're renewing your enterprise contract, it might be worth to see what are the options for you to include the licenses which you might potentially need in the future, even if it's, let's say, a year down the line. If you're doing a 3-year renewal, it still might be worth, and it might be financially responsible as well, to include those licenses and kind of plan a bit further ahead as part of that specific renewal. Subsequently, if you decide to drop support for a product, if you decide we do not need to support this anymore, make sure that this is in line with business planning, because some vendors will charge you if you want to reinstate the support in the future. Again, using IBM as an example, if you renew the support for a specific product, the price for that renewal for a year is about 20% of what you would pay for a completely new license. But if you want to reinstate that support, if you keep the support lapsed for a year or two and then you want to reinstate again, that cost is about 60% of price of a new license. So it can add up quite quickly. So if you want to drop support, just make sure that it is in line with your business planning and you won't need reinstatement of that specific support in the future, because it might just be financially better to keep supporting the product until you get to the point where you need the support again. If you're considering using a third-party provider, which is perfectly fine, but for different vendors, there are different rules. So make sure that this is in line with the compliance rules of the specific vendor. Some vendors might have limitations when it comes to third-party support. Some vendors might not allow it for certain products. So if you want to go down that road, just make sure that this is not going to affect your compliance situation with the specific vendor. If you want to lower the renewal value, generally speaking, gradually lowering the renewal value is easier to justify to the vendor. But thinking about how some of the renewals that you'll be doing will be kind of long term, it might not be fast enough from the business perspective. So gradually lowering over multiple renewals, if one renewal is not for a year, but it might be, for example, for 3 years, it might not be fast enough for the business to kind of get the financial savings, but it's definitely better and it's easier to justify to the vendor. And why it's easier to justify it, we're gonna see on the next slide. Yeah, so Unfortunately, renewals kind of comes with risks or can come with risks. So as we said, gradually lowering the value of the renewal is easier to justify, because if the value of the renewal significantly drops, usually this triggers interest from the vendors, and also it can be an audit trigger from their side. So if you go kind of from 100 to 0 within one renewal, the vendor will come to a conclusion that it's better for them to check if you really decommissioned everything, you've really got rid of all the products that you've been using before, and it might trigger an audit. So it's easy to justify if the numbers go gradually down, because you might be phasing out the product, or you might be doing some upgrades in your system. It's better to do it this way, but as we said, it might not be fast enough for the business. For some of the products or bundles, you might not be allowed to lower the support without breaking the bundle. So this can happen especially for bigger vendors such as Oracle and IBM. You might find yourself in the situation where if you purchase the products in a bundle, or for certain products, it is just not allowed to lower the support. And what the vendor will want you to do is to essentially take in a completely new contract or a part of the contract which is going to be affecting these specific products. So it might not be, again, financially responsible to do that. So just make sure that if you have that plan, make sure that you will be allowed to lower the support for those specific products or bundles that you have in mind. When you come to the negotiations with the vendor, and you essentially come with a situation that you want to lower the value of the renewal, the vendor is very likely to offer you other applications or solutions to keep the value of the contract. So they might say, okay, you want to get rid of this database, but what if we give you this solution? It's a data management solution. It's great. It works fine. Make sure that you review your business needs and plan to have an informed discussion with the vendor, because they are very likely to offer you other applications and solutions. And it's always good to kind of come to the table prepared and know that either you do not plan to deploy any new products from that specific vendor, or if you do, you might bring that to the table and say, yes, we would like X, Y, Z, and kind of tailor what you're getting as part of the renewal from the vendor. So having all this information, which you should be gathering in the process of preparing for the renewal, is going to strengthen your position when you are negotiating the renewal with a specific vendor. Also, if it's allowed by the vendor, this might not be allowed by every vendor, but if it's allowed, consider if you want to negotiate a completely new contract, or if you would rather to extend the current one to keep potentially beneficial conditions in place. This is for vendors such as IBM, for example. You might find yourself in a situation where your original contract, which you've been extending for quite some time, might have some conditions which are beneficial for you. So there might be some instruments which you think might be handy, or conditions about audits or different things which you want to keep, but they might not be available if you negotiate a completely new contract with the vendor. So if you are in that situation, your only option how to keep the original conditions might be to basically extend the original contract. So if that is possible with the specific vendor, it might be something that you want to consider.
Good information. So yeah, we'll carry on with some more specific bits then. I think that's a good general introduction. So thank you for that, Katrina. So I mean, the key out of all of this is prepare well and make sure you're aware of the risks. And if you prepare well, you should be. And then that allows you to then optimally start negotiating and actually reducing those contracts rather than having to worry about the risk. So specifically, because there was, as Ben mentioned, a lot of questions on Microsoft. Now, we could probably have an entire session purely on how we recommend dealing with Microsoft renewals, but let's just have a look at some of the basics and some of our main recommendations when you're renewing. So specifically, Microsoft, a fairly standard 3-year sales process across all agreements. It's also while their support software assurance usually comes in 3-year chunks. In part of enterprise, it could be shorter, it could be a bit different, but the principle is you usually get a license plus 3-year support. So every 3 year, they will come back around. What they always focus on nowadays will be trying to sell cloud, which is both Azure or the whole M365 product group. So they will do whatever they can to do that. That's where they get their main bonuses from. But also trying to upgrade you to more extensive license sets. For example, moving from Office 365 to Microsoft 365, which includes the Microsoft operating system and a few other bits and pieces as well, depending on that, or from E3 to E5, which has a little bit more security, other features that some people might find useful, and so onward. And now, while this is all good, and they will have heavy discounts for this, obviously keep in mind Microsoft has a strategy behind this. They know if they get you hooked on cloud and get you on these very expensive license types with every kind of product involved, they just get you hooked on in their system, where every year you keep spending that money because it's a cloud subscription. You can't just step out tomorrow. At the same time, once you're using one feature from E5, you're not going to want to step back again to E3 because you're using that now. So keep that in mind when you agree to these heavy discounts potentially, that there is a reason they're giving these discounts, because they know they're going to make the money back later when you are in that system where you have to keep renewing the same products. Doesn't mean it can't be good software, doesn't mean it can't be good reasons why you want to do it, but be careful agreeing to this now, because it will reduce your leverage later when you have to renew it anyway and you can't step down anymore. But doesn't mean you can't disable the new features as well, of course. Now, when you're renewing, the most common agreement is still the enterprise agreement. A vast majority of medium to large size businesses have at least one of those, if not multiple. There's two components to this. So obviously, often this will get mixed, where people call everything a true up or everything a renewal. In specific term, usually what will happen is year 1 and 2 is the true up, where your agreement stays valid exactly the same. And all your products, your pricing are locked in. You can introduce some new products, but it will come at a cost because you can't renegotiate. So often you'll pay extra if you want to add a new product in after a year of having your agreement. So the focus is not necessarily on renegotiating everything. It's probably not going to be possible anyway. The focus should be on minimizing your usage, seeing if there's no true down possible, because for many products it is possible, seeing if you can do some optimization products, getting requirements, or obviously if you are planning on getting some new software in, how would you add that in? And then once year 3 comes around, it's the proper renewal where Microsoft will just terminate your agreement and they'll say, all right, let's start from scratch. What products do you want the next 3 years? What pricing can we agree on? And obviously Microsoft will increase that pricing just a little bit. So it will be very difficult to get your pricing below the previous set. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's rare at the very least. And usually it means you have to have grown quite a bit for Microsoft to do that. So the focus here is to set your foundation for pricing for products the next 3 years, carefully plan and making sure you've got everything set perfectly to go. Because this is where if you do this not well, then obviously you're on the hook for the next 3 years. It's going to be difficult to renegotiate. Keep in mind as well that while Microsoft doesn't advertise this officially, or not, at least not every Microsoft representative will, you can get approved for a 1 to even 3 year enterprise agreement extension. So your old pricing, if you had some very heavy discounts, then it can be beneficial to try and negotiate that with Microsoft and see if you can't just extend it going forward for a few more years, just so you've got that in case you want to. In the end, so how do you then actually properly negotiate? So yeah, Microsoft will be preparing early for these, especially the big renewals. Your account manager will be aware, will be asking information, will be looking around, even if they don't notify you in the background, especially if you're a big customer, they will already be thinking about how we're going to approach this company to make sure we get as much money out of them as possible, which obviously they will also try and sell you on new products. So it's not necessarily a purely money grabbing. They are trying to give you something in return, but in the end, that's where they get their bonuses. How much value is this contract worth? So that's where you have to kind of the most struggle to get that down. So as already mentioned, what do you do then? One, prepare early, include your entire estate. People now very often seem to focus entirely on Office 365, but make sure that when you do initial review, when you look around, check every product, make sure you're clear that you still need those licenses. Often you do, make sure that you are checking every nook and cranny to make sure that you're fine. And that you know where also you might be able to optimize something. If you look at your entire estate, you might find some little bits and pieces that you hadn't think about. And keep in mind that starting early is especially important if you want to get some optimization done, because I've never heard about a DBA say, oh, you want to consolidate or SQL databases, I'll get that done next month. It's always going to be a 3, 4, 5, 6 month project at the very least, if not more. I've seen these taking years. So if you want to get some optimization done, it was going to cost a good chunk of money, but once they're actually executed, they will pay back on themselves. And some of the common ones that we've recommended is one, a SQL server. It's such a spread out the business usually, making sure you know exactly where they are, consolidating them, figuring out what's the optimal setup, making them as optimized as possible can really help. Office 365, we'll talk about in the next point, but it is such a easy thing to add users, add accounts, add things in Office 365, but very rarely is it properly cleaned up. And even if you think you've got a process for it, there's usually still some things slipping through the cracks. And then there's other things like, for example, making sure that your development environment is properly consolidated, licensed. It can change a lot in that value of that contract. The second point is, as we already just mentioned, watch out for that usage creep in cloud. It's very easy to keep adding on Azure, Microsoft 365. Your developers love just spinning up new machines because that's what they need to do. But make sure there's some controls to limit that exchange. And obviously something will still happen, or if you did not have controls, it can actually be beneficial to review your consoles and have someone, even if it's one by one, going to those systems to try and find accounts that can be disabled. Because if you can disable 100 accounts, it can be worth almost someone's year's salary as well, depending on which kind of accounts they find to disable, of course. And or just finding a few of those Azure machines that you can turn off, reduce. It can make quite a bit of difference. And one of the things there is that there's a lot of hidden features as well in these programs that Microsoft doesn't publish. Specifically F65, there is ways that you can detect which features are being used out of your licenses, which just are not going to be shown because Microsoft knows if they make it too obvious, people are actually going to reduce their spending and they'll reduce their profits. But there is tools available on the market, or there is professional ways to get to the bottom of this and find some of these bits and pieces, depending on your management. That could be interesting. As a last point for that whole 365 part is profiling users. Microsoft has a wide variety of user accounts or licenses that are allowed. Even if you're considering going for E5, try to review whether or not everybody will use that. Maybe some users are still fine with an E3. Does everyone actually need that Office installed on their laptop? Probably some people are going to be fine just having an online interface because it's only selected people that will be working in Office all day long or every day long. And some others will just open it every once in a while. So the question is, who actually still needs all of the features and where can you scale that down? And building these pro business and saying, all right, You start there. That means this is the kind of profile you have. If you want to be an exception, then you have to put in a special request to get upgraded to higher license, and you'd also have to get a good validation. It can really help you just keeping that cost down. But that said, about 365, like I said, it's Microsoft is primarily focused on the whole 365, and most of our customers seem to as well. However, it could actually be smart to try and look for your old perpetual licenses that see what you can still use. Often, you can use them without software assurance as well. So even if you stop maintenance a few years ago, that's still a pretty solid license that you can apply. There is some things that you can't do without software assurance, but just try and figuring out or separating your environment. In one part of the environment is for older software. If you still got an old 2012 deployment and so onwards, where you barely do anything with, it could be smart to put it separately, say, all right, we're going to stop software assurance there and keep it on the newer environment that we want to keep maintaining, that we're going to use going forward. It could actually help you reduce some cost there. If you're wondering, hey, where do I find about these licenses? There is obviously the online resources VLSC, but something slightly lesser known is that you can actually ask for a Microsoft licensing statement from your reseller, who will then ask Microsoft for this, which will include every license that was ever purchased from your company or any company that was affiliated with yourself. And they will more than happily share this with you as far as we're concerned, as far as our experience go. So this can help you identify a lot of your license history, some extra contracts you were not aware of. Maybe if someone in another team, another business part of the business bought some software, it will find us together. And as a last recommendation is consolidating agreements. So Microsoft discount levels tend to work based on the size of your agreement. So if you've got multiple environments, multiple subsidiaries, potentially components, teams, maybe multiple contracts on its own, it doesn't have to be a separate environment. It could just be one product in a select agreement, one in an enterprise agreement. It could be worthwhile to see, can we not put this together, put it in one big negotiation and see, can we get our discount levels up? Now, this is a quick summary of some of our recommendations on Microsoft. Oh, that's helpful if people had to just at the question of, hey, can you help with Microsoft? But definitely if there's specific points that you want to get some more help with, put in a question in the question box and we'll have a look. But otherwise, we'll carry on and have a look at some of the other more specific questions, often vendor specific, and see what our thoughts are on this. The first one we've got here is VMware ELE gotchas. So just not being able to break the bundle down the road. Subsequent years, M&S renewals are all or none. And absolutely, this was is exactly right. One of the big compliance issues in VMware is that, or just issues, is that people have bought a big package and then want to break it down and so onwards. It just, yeah, they will not really allow it. Usually an ELA is once you agree to it, you're hooked on it for several years. So be careful with that. So in general, what we recommend is obviously to look into that. One of the things that VMware has gotten very big on these last years is, or actually already quite some years, is adding Hpp spending and so onwards. So it's their way of saying, hey, pay us a big pot of money now, and you can use it over the next few years. But obviously, this doesn't make too much sense. Yes, you're gonna reduce pricing, but make sure that you're actually gonna use this. One thing we've noticed is that the vast majority of our customers are moving away from on-premise and moving towards going into the cloud, going to Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, pick your cloud out there. So if you're moving to the cloud already, your VMware spending is probably going to reduce. So it can make sense to agree to have some worse pricing, but not have this giant pot of money that you're spending initially and you're not going to use it. So especially VMware, we'd recommend unless if you've got a very heavily, we need everything on premise, cannot move to the cloud. If there's even a slight shimmer of we might move a lot to the cloud, try to be hard in those negotiations. Accept a little bit of worse pricing if it means that you don't have to agree to a giant pot of money you pay now that you might use in the future. Just simply because most customers don't do it anymore. Generally, VMware estates reduce, generally they're not going to go up. Doesn't mean that that's the case for everyone, of course, especially if you've got big data centers that you need to support. So that's just one of the points we would recommend. There is other things as well, like VMware has heavy restrictions to territories where you're using your software. If you're an international organization, it can be smart to keep an eye on that, make sure that you consolidate those agreements, that you get all the right entities, environments included in there. And yeah, just keep in mind that your agreement tends to be for several years. So if you're locked into something now, you generally have to wait until the end of the next ELE of the ELA to renegotiate that. So that's just a few pointers for VMware. So the next question we have, is it advisable to purchase directly to your principal software vendor if allowed? And for example, Microsoft, very big, they try to prefer going to resellers. So it's almost impossible as a big company not have a reseller anywhere. But in general, yes, it is possible to purchase to a reseller instead. And when is it due? Katrina, what's your view on that?
So looking at this question from the perspective of IBM, which is my main focus, I would say in this case, whether to purchase directly from the vendor or go through the reseller, it kind of depends what is your goal. If you go directly to the vendor, it means that you are building a relationship with that specific account manager, and you know that they know your name, and you are kind of building a relationship between you and the vendor directly. As opposition to that, if you go through a reseller, you might be able to kind of offload a little bit of that work to the reseller. And this might be interesting, especially in a situation where you might be purchasing several different vendors through the same reseller. In that case, you're getting the benefit of, again, building the relationship with the reseller instead. And you might find yourself in a situation where the reseller will be helpful to kind of help you stay on track. Potentially they can offer you discounts. Kind of, the bigger the customer you get for the reseller, the more interesting as a customer you're going to be. So it kind of depends what is your end goal. If you are happy to work with the reseller, then go for it. It might be beneficial, especially if you're purchasing several vendors through the same reseller. If you go directly to the vendor, you might benefit from having a bit more of a personal touch, and they can also offer you discounts. They can advise you on potential future projects. But kind of keep in mind that whether you're talking to the vendor or to the reseller, their goal is to make money. So it kind of depends also which one you're more comfortable with. I would say from IBM's perspective, if you are not purchasing a huge amount of licenses, I think it's fine to go either way. You probably will not have an account manager with IBM, and you would be just purchasing products through Passport Advantage. So it might be slightly better to go to a reseller to kind of have that person that you can go to if you have any questions. If you have bigger accounts, it might be worth to go to IBM directly to see what you can negotiate with them. But if you don't want to go through all of that hassle, it's completely fine to go to a reseller.
Absolutely. I think some of the key points there as well is, obviously a reseller, they have their way they make money is by getting a percentage on every sale. And usually that's agreed between the resellers and the software vendors, what percentage they get. Or upfront, often it's calculated as part of the price, so it's not necessarily that the price will be more expensive, but in some occasions it could actually be cheaper to go straight to the software vendor, especially if you've got a big contract and you might want to negotiate and get that relationship Katrina mentioned. Could be helpful. But the other hand, and while it depends a bit on reseller to reseller as well. Some of them are genuinely, or at least seem like they want to help their customers because they know that's how they build a relationship. So some of them will actually have proper advisors ready and so onwards to help you with that contract, help you with your day-to-day and so on. So it could be helpful to have that as well. I think one of the main parts is, or some of the main things that you could see, which should I do in this case, is one, as Katrina mentioned, is it a big contract? Yes or no? Big contracts, it's good to at least have a direct connection with the vendor as well, just so you can get a feeling of how they're working and so onwards. And potentially even get a third-party advisor then to help you on the side where you need to. For a small contract, it might make sense to go resell. But one other point as well that people generally don't focus on is how mature is your SAM team, or just your procurement team, or all of that. How mature is your software asset management practice? Because in the end, one of the big advantages of a reseller is you've got one point to go to, and you don't have to go straight away to the vendor. Often they can help you maintain your licenses, with entitlement details, they can help you get reports back. While we've seen it way too many times, people or companies that always go to the latest, the cheapest bidder, the cheapest reseller. And 1 year they buy with reseller A, year 2 with reseller B, year 3 with reseller C. After 3 years, they forget which licenses were purchased, where, when, what, forget to get that support back up. Especially if you go straight to the vendor, vendors are not going to remind you necessarily. Some will, some won't, or at least they won't consolidate these old licenses and might just work to the next deal. So while a reseller might actually help you keep some control there, and at least have someone sending you reports on your purchases if they happen throughout the business. So they have to come into one place, and you can so it can help you build some control if you don't have much trust in your SAM practice, in your internal management of your entitlement. So it's a balance to make, and it can be different from vendor to vendor as well. Some will prefer to work with companies directly and won't even work with a reseller. So the next one we have is when to RFP versus when to enter exclusive extension negotiations. So this we understood as exclusive agreements with your resellers, with your vendors, and how do you go forward? Katrina, what's your point of view here?
I think for this question, it's quite important to kind of consider what level of control and trust you have over your SAM practices and governance. So from my perspective, I would say if you are confident in your SAM practices and you know that you have robust methods how to make sure that you keep track of everything, that you review usage, that you kind of stay on top of software asset management on a daily basis. If you feel confident and if you feel like that's a good point, from my perspective, if you choose to enter the negotiation straight away, that should be fine because you already have that security and that control over your software asset management. If you are not that sure, or if you think there might be some things that need improvement, some potential issues, I would say it's probably reasonable to consider RFP to see what are the options, to see that, you know, as you mentioned before, there might be resellers which will be willing to kind of help you with this, guide you as well. So it might be beneficial to have a look at what is out there.
Yeah, and in the end, obviously, you can have a balance in between as well, where you have a few resellers that you work against each other and see who can who does which deal, and see how they stack up compared to one another. So yeah, carrying on, share information on Oracle renewal timing and conditions. Now, this is similar to many publishers. You've got your you can have contracts renewals coming throughout the year. So but obviously end of financial year is when renewals will be focused, same for Oracle as for anyone. But in the end, it can be anywhere throughout the year. Now, the one big thing for Oracle is what kind of renewal are you doing? If it's a very small one, again, probably it doesn't matter too much. But if you have a big Oracle renewal, definitely be very early and definitely manage that very early. A specific case, and it's a very broad question, so it's difficult to answer in every specific case or every case, is if you have a PULA or just a general ULA in an unlimited agreement, which obviously is great, but what will happen standard is that Oracle will add their 4% or whatever they will do for your company every year, and your contract just keeps expanding. So if you ever want to get out there, the key is to start very early and to really get your entire environment together. Start looking around the business, see what's possible, what's not, what can you do, what not. Make sure there is no compliance issues around, and then often it can be helpful to try, if you're really getting locked in that agreement, take that entire year, make sure that you have your usage properly lined up. You know exactly what's going to go on, you know exactly what you want to reach. One thing that Oracle and yeah, there's a few other vendors, SAP, IBM come to mind, are very scared of, is people moving to third-party support. So even if you're not planning to move to third-party support, having all that data ready, going to a third-party support provider and just asking them, what would it mean if we move? And just then telling Oracle, hey, we've had this chat with a third-party support provider, this is what they told us, why are we still with you? It can really push their sales team to get scared and start thinking about how can they optimize your agreement. So taking that time is key. And yeah, which conditions you want in your agreement, like I said, from a principle, do not like unlimited agreements. Yes, it's easy. Yes, it can help you control. It is the software which happens to get out of control with the whole, you're not allowed to put databases on VMware, or you're almost a million in shortfalls straight away, except if it's a super controlled environment, can make it very dangerous. But even then, the unlimited agreement, there is a reason they're allowing this. That's because they get their value out of it. They get their money back, and they know it in the long term that at the very least you'll keep deploying software, so you will be stuck in that agreement forever. So be careful of that. There's other specific questions on that to go ahead, but otherwise we'll move forward. Specifically, SAP is, again, a very difficult vendor to negotiate with. And because unlike, you know, you've got other Microsoft, every 3 to 5 years, if you extend a bit or something, you can renegotiate a contract entirely. So it gives you a lot of leverage. Them as well, it can help them with expanding your contract, but you as well, because you can do that. Something like IBM, Oracle, they might not renew or change the contract every few years, but it's possible. Sometimes you end your agreement, start a new one, change it, and so onwards. There is options you can do this. SAP is a bit the big exception there. They are one of the largest vendors out there, number 4 by most records, but their method is your first contract can never be ended pretty much. You only amend it and make changes, which brings a lot of power into the SAP court, because they can choose whether or not they allow you to reduce your contract. It's almost impossible to end it except ending the entire term, the entire agreement, and getting locked out of any of it forever. It's so you have to stick with a rule. Now, the one thing is, if you want to avoid, and it's the same with other vendors, exchanging software is always easier than reducing it. So if you are planning to buy new software, always double check that there's no software you're not using anymore. Because don't work towards that renewal. Work towards a point where you want to step to SAP and say, hey, I want new software. Because that's the point where you have some power. where you can say, look, I want this new software package. And that's when they're going to try and sell it to you. So if you then say, oh, by the way, we have these old contracts we don't longer want, that's when they're going to agree to terminate some licenses, to end it, and so onwards. So keep that in mind, that work towards when you've got software that you want to buy is often better than working towards when you want to get rid of software. One other thing that you could keep in mind for SAP is that they're always same as Oracle, and very much as Oracle, so are very scared of people moving to third-party support. So as soon as you've got that, it can be very valuable to bring it in the mix and see it. Know your contract very well, see what's possible, what's not out there. But with SAP, also be very careful because they do their annual audits. And this is standard built into their contracts. If you've got a big SAP estate, I'm sure they will come by annually and check that. Practically, they often just ignore half of their findings on purpose because they want to keep them behind for when they need them. So do not trust any SAP report from a year old because you're not sure if they did their work properly. They might have just only looked for 1 or 2 items that they could focus on to get your renewal up to speed, upgrade again, and keep a few behind that they will use the next year, or that they just didn't check at all. So if you're planning on very hard negotiations with SAP, make sure you get you know your environment very well, get your law, USM reports, or if you've got cloud use, there's a lot more flexibility there. They're still not as common as for some other vendors, but there you might have term licenses, so you can actually prepare that well. But it's a whole balance of SAP will be very difficult to bring down in how much you spend with them. That about SAP. Another one is, how do you manage changing license metrics for Oracle, specifically NUP, CPU, for certain databases? Now, the basic is prepare and bring it up and see what they recommend. But the key is prepare and make sure the Oracle publishes their price list online. It's not going to match with your pricing, but at the very least, you can see if we calculate it in the price online, how does the cost compare, and bring it up to your account manager, to anyone else there. Katrina, just in general, what's your view on changing license types?
So I think when you're going, like in here in this example, so when you're going from named user plus to CPU licenses, since there is a huge difference in the prices, and there are obviously some minimums for named user plus compared to CPU licensing. Essentially, you should be prepared to show Oracle that you are certain about what the new usage is going to be. So what is going to be the configurations of the databases, which will be switching from named user plus to CPU, to make sure that you have proper conditions in place, you know, whether we're talking about partitioning, to make sure that you, if you want to go with hard partitioning, to make sure that you're really fulfilling all of the conditions, because Oracle is going to be asking these questions. And the price difference between named user plus obviously depends about how many named user plus you had in the original contract. Since the price difference is quite big, I think that this is essentially going to be a point where probably Oracle is going to be pushing you to have a separate contract for the CPU licenses, or have an amendment to the contract for the CPU licenses, because they don't necessarily really do, let's say, transition between named user plus to CPUs. That's a bit unusual. So unless you have a leverage with spending a lot of money with Oracle in general, then they might be a bit more inclined to give you some favorable options. But essentially, if you want to do that, just make sure that you have all the information ready, because Oracle will want to know that the numbers that you're asking for the CPUs are based on some hard data, and they will want to see that before they allow the switch.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very as part of the point what Katrina just mentioned, that yeah, they are going to check your entitlement. You are going to check that you're doing the right thing with your new licenses. And this is definitely true because especially if you're planning that to do this kind of move to reduce the cost of your contract, what they might do is start and contact someone in the LMS departments, their compliance department, say, hey, can we not do a friendly audit with them? But do keep in mind, once you get them involved, they will double check everything carefully, even too carefully, where they might find compliance issues. So this could backfire a lot. So make sure you're prepared for that. Now, we do know that nowadays Oracle has gone a little bit more lenient in the harsh compliance approach, and they've actually established a new department, SIA, so SIA, which is supposedly an extension of LMS, but more oriented towards supporting customers. From what I've heard so far, it's actually that they don't get sales incentives, so it could be that these are more trustworthy in these kind of cases. But still, even if you've got one of these people on board and you can trust them somewhat, it doesn't mean that your account manager isn't still going to try and maximize the sales revenue, of course, and still not going to try to use the information from that process to increase your sales. So always be careful when you're changing licenses that you're properly prepared for any scrutiny, because if the contract is going to go down in value, you can definitely expect that they're going to double check. And if they don't double check, be even more careful, because it could very well be that you get hit later on when you do try to reduce that contract. So I think that's a bit of the main questions that we received there. Yeah, which it was fairly broad, of course. So because yeah, we tried to cover a little bit of a lot of vendors. But I don't know if there's anyone that still has a question that was not answered, or a specific add-on to what we've just discussed. Please feel free to open the chat or the question window and just type it out there. We will stay on for a few more minutes to wait, but otherwise, if we do not, then, or if no one has a question, then we can probably close it. All right. No activity so far, so it must be that we were quite thorough, and everyone knows everything about renewals now. There we go. Someone has one more question. Do you have some experience and recommendation to share about Adobe? We absolutely have experience with Adobe. So Adobe, obviously, you know, they used to have their perpetual licenses. Nowadays, you can almost get nothing perpetual anymore. So the key here is getting your cloud subscriptions, everything on point. And the issue there is that, one, you might still have old licenses deployed. So if you're moving, if you still have perpetual old licenses, keep a close eye on that and make sure they're all under control. You know, where, when, who, and so onwards is this product is about. But if you have moved everything to the cloud, then the key is keep a tight eye on that console. In the end, the list of users in there is the list of users you're going to have to support in your next renewal. Make sure they all use that software. Especially a very common thing we're seeing is users or just general that have the full Adobe Cloud for Teams package, when they really just need one tool, or they need one tool once, they use Photoshop one time a year, and then they've got it installed the rest of the year. So this is the same with most of these cloud tools, is keep a very close eye on your user list. Make sure that the SAM department knows them, that in the end that there is some kind of approval, that they at least every year has to click a button to say, yes, I still want my license. And hopefully that can help reduce that cost a bit. But in the end, yeah, it is down to that usually where you just see. And one thing that could be done as well is Adobe's desktop tools. Does everyone need that? most people using Photoshop do not need Photoshop. Most people having Acrobat do not need Acrobat. There is a lot of alternatives out there. So look out for alternatives and clean up those consoles. I hope that gives you a little bit of insight there. I think that's then it. No more questions coming in. So thank you everyone that joined. Hopefully this was a bit useful. Hopefully you picked up a trick or a bit here and there. And yeah, hope to catch you on the next webinar.
Thank you very much for your participation.